As we're settling and switching over, I'd like to introduce Brian Perillat, the crystal ball of cattle markets. Brian is a manager with Canfax and has been with them since April 2010. He grew up on a mixed family operation near Duck Lake, Saskatchewan, and continues to be involved with a family farm. Prior to working with Canfax, Brian worked as a livestock production economist with Alberta Agriculture and has spent over 4 years working with MMP as a farm management consultant. Brian has had the privilege of traveling and working on farms and stations in Australia, New Zealand, as well as visiting farms in North and West Africa. And I would just add, if you are having conversations around the top of the auditorium, to please move those conversations out into the hall so that we can have our full attention for the next speaker. Thank you very much. And join me in welcoming Brian.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's certainly a pleasure to be here in Manitoba and catch some sunshine. And it's always a great show to come and meet some people, learn some things. And came out to Manitoba to even find out we can't even send our Prime Minister to pick up donuts properly. So it's always a good time to visit with everyone here. I'll be covering the cattle markets today, so I'm sure a lot of you here probably more in the cow-calf sector, and we'll try and talk about some of the main factors that are driving that. But I certainly want to start at a pretty high level. There's so much going on globally right now around the world that actually looks very optimistic. We've got our pressures from the outside, but from the actual fundamentals of the meat and red meat markets especially, there's a lot to look forward to, and I'll go over that. So I'll start a little bit with some global ideas and some global perspectives, talk about the United States, and then bring it home back to Canada and Manitoba here. So, starting off, just look, big picture. We talk a lot about supply, and a big thing we talk about cattle industry, because we kind of know roughly cattle numbers. We know how much beef we produce or expected to produce. And one thing we don't talk enough about probably is demand. It's hard to measure, really. Do we know how much are people going to want to buy? How much are we going to be able to export? What are those prices are going to look like? But one of the best things in the last 2 to 3 years of the beef market really has been demand. Both domestically, North America wide, we're seeing extremely good prices. We've seen big strength in the United States, especially despite them increasing beef production as much as they have. Just for instance, the U.S. is looking at record beef production this year, and they're importing, and last year they actually imported more beef than they exported. Maybe that sounds a little disappointing in some perspectives, but on the other hand, that just shows how strong U.S. beef prices are, despite having record production, which goes back to very strong demand. Consumers are still willing to eat beef. There are some pressures out there, we hear from these groups, and we see a lot of commercials and a lot of topics that are kind of anti-beef, production. But overall, consumers are still paying with their pocketbook. Our Canadian beef production, we've actually seen across North America, meat production or meat consumption is growing as well. Canada, maybe not as much. Partly we've seen really strong exports and such, but our per capita consumption's kind of leveled off. And we're seeing record export values as well. Big jump, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. If we look at Canada alone, an interesting part of that is our production in 2019, we produced 5% more beef. And compared to the low in 2015, our beef production's up over 20%, almost 25% more beef we're producing here. That's even faster growth rate than the United States. So again, we are being very competitive on that side of things in some aspects of our industry. And I'll talk a bit more about the numbers. So just to sit back, my current sentiment kind of thing on the industry is, the big picture looks pretty darn good. I'm fairly bullish on red meats, the markets. The issue we do struggle a little bit is how much is going to come back to the cattle producers. We saw that in 2019 especially. Beef prices were quite a lot higher than 2018, but our cattle prices were actually slightly lower. A little disappointing there, but we got to remember in North America in the last since about 2015, we've added well over 2 million cows to our industry, to our herd, but we haven't added any packing plants. And again, let's just call a spade a spade. The packers have made pretty good money as of late, but maybe that is starting to shift was a big plant that got on fire in the United States last year. One of the biggest plants in the States for 3-4 months shut down, and that affected the marketplace to some extent. Ontario, riding Regency, the Ontario plant that closed in Toronto, that's sort of shifted, and that's an effect on Manitoba. That's starting to affect a little bit how many cattle are going to Ontario, and that affects your demand in Manitoba for your calves. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But hopefully, we've seen a little bit of expansion in some smaller plants and if cattle numbers level off, hopefully the producers can get a little more of that dollar this year and going forward. So looking globally at different meat production, obviously if you look at beef, it's been pretty darn flat over the last 10 years, basically over the decade. Tiny little incremental changes, but nothing like you've seen. Look at poultry and chicken, how much it's grown. And the pork one is really, that is the centerpiece of pretty much any international meetings or trade or markets you talk about. That's pork. And you can see that might even be a little bit low to estimate, but we've seen so many hogs. I presume most people here are familiar with the African swine fever in China and, them losing 40 to 60% of their pigs. We don't really know, but that's potentially around a quarter of the global pig population's been lost due to this disease. And it's not, it's Thailand, Vietnam, some other pretty major pork producing countries. So over the last 2 years, we've actually seen global meat production fall 2 years in a row. I went back 50 years. It's never happened before, where we've actually had 2 years in a row of smaller meat production globally. And that's where the demand side comes in. If you look at that shortfall due to China, there's not enough. If you took all the pork that was exported in 2007 and you shipped it all to China, pretend they bought all of the global pork that traded, it still wouldn't offset what African swine fever's done to their industry. So we've seen much higher prices there, with their porks up over 200%, doubling in price. Beef's even up 20%. So that's really, realistically, that's where a lot of the optimism comes from globally from this side of it. And on the other side is beef. The second part of beef demand, and the real big driver of beef demand, is not population, it's wealth, it's income. China now has more middle class than the entire United States population. They all want to eat a little bit of beef or more beef, and they can't grow it there. They're going to be looking to import it, and again, that's why I think from a beef industry perspective, there's a lot of opportunity there. Pork will come back. It'll take a few years, but the beef side, if growing wealth, more people want to eat more beef first they want to eat more meat as they get more money, and then as they get wealthier into the middle class, it's more beef. And that's going to be provided by basically South America and North America are going to be the main exporters of that and benefit the most. I mentioned about exports. These are export values here. Again, we said over $3 billion of exports of beef alone, $3.3 billion roughly. Biggest partner is still the United States. They take about 70% of our beef. But you can see China, Japan are growing. China shut their border to us for 4 months and are still in the top 5 for export markets. In 2010, China was barely on the radar. And then Japan with TPP deal coming in, with our tariff reductions, we saw the yellow bar. Japan jumped to be our second biggest export market. Big growth there. And I think the most exciting part, if you look about exports and values, in the last 2 years, we've sold more beef and we've sold it at higher prices. Typically in any commodity market, you produce more and you put it on the market, prices go down. Well, here we're actually selling more beef at higher prices. That's kind of by far the best case scenario. So again, pretty optimistic there. Here's the China chart. If you look at the red line, that's your production of beef in China. And for years, up till about 2010, they basically consumed what they produced. But again, when the wealth kicked in, they started looking for more beef, consuming more beef. Consumption was outstripping production by a long shot. And look at the green line is your imports. It's been almost exponential growth into China. And they're looking to grow that again, possibly 20% more, partly with this protein deficit into China. So again, that's the big thing. It's becoming real. We talked about China probably for 20 years, but it's starting to become real now in terms of what that market can do for us going forward. And for years, the United States, I don't know if you're aware, the United States was the biggest importer of beef for basically forever until 2 years ago. And China has now become the biggest importer of beef. We've still got some restrictions to get into that market. But if you look at Uruguay, Australia, and New Zealand, they're the 3 biggest suppliers of beef to North America. We used to kind of be their number 1 destination. All of those markets are shifting. Piles of their beef is going to China now and not coming into Canada. So again, that supports our market. We don't ship a ton of beef to China, but it's taking product away and shorting our market a little bit. The other big one is Australia. Another one of the biggest exporters in the world. I'll just touch on them briefly. Obviously, they have huge issues. We're all aware of the fires, but they've been going through droughts for 3-4 years. And basically, they cannot maintain their export pace. They just can't. Their herd's the smallest in over 30 years. When they do finally get some rains, they're getting some spotty rains, but they can either gonna basically continue to dwindle down their herd, and they'll find an equilibrium. But if they do get rain, or when they get rain, and those numbers they start to restock, you think about 2014 in the United States and how prices shot up, trying to rebuild off a small herd. Similar case in Australia, and they're just not going to be able to export as much either. So, we're seeing good demand, and we could see a little less competition out there. And what's the China effect? Here's kind of the story about this green line here. That's fresh trim. That's kind of a lot of cow beef, 85-90% trim price. That's like ground beef. What's it worth? Well, you can see normally in the fall time, we see a lot of weakness in that market. Well, again, last fall, U.S. 90% trim prices hit record high levels, the imported price hit record high levels, again, due to China buying. Australia was really short. And that's very supportive to our market, having that high trim prices. If you got cull cows, we've seen them pick up a little bit. I think the cull cow market should be fairly strong. And this side here, that just shows how trim prices, basically they support or follow the wholesale cutout price. So you take a fed animal. At this point in the States, there's parts of the beef animal like round, different quarters, different parts of the pram, that goes to the grinder. They can actually add value to our fed cattle market. So it just supports the whole market complex for cattle. And it's tough to get too bearish when we have this kind of a situation going on. Talking about the United States now, they've been through a pretty massive expansion, probably faster and bigger than we thought they would have gone through. But after the drought, they've repopulated their herd. They expanded a little bit, but if you look at the chart, really they haven't gone back to the old peak. They've added, like I said, over 2 million beef cows. But I think the big news on the U.S. side is they're probably done expanding. I think expansion's over. They might even see a slight contraction this year. We'll see. Their numbers will be out in a couple weeks of how many cattle are in the United States. There might be a few more cattle, but there could actually be a few less cows. So once we start talking about a smaller cow herd, or even just a stabilizing cow herd in the United States, that takes a little bit of pressure off. We know growth, we know demand is growing. If we have growing demand and flat supplies, that bodes well for prices. You can see the black line, So the black line, that's beef production. So, we saw 2015, 2014, 15, when we saw this drop. That's the years our prices exploded. But look where we're at. They've recovered within 5 years to now we're into new record production levels. And think of where cattle prices are. As I started off, demand has been great in this market. With us this much beef on the marketplace, our calf prices are holding in pretty good. And this is probably going to level off. They'll have a little more beef this year. They start culling more heifers, culling more cows, that sort of thing. But it's also going to slow down. That's a fairly steep, increase in beef production over the last few years. So that'll slow down. And with that herd leveling off, we shouldn't see too much more beef production in a couple of years. We should be near our peak production for this cycle. Hopefully with good demand, that still bodes well for prices as well for cattle. We've talked this, I always get asked about this beyond meat, beyond beef, beyond dog food is a better name, but nobody likes that term, but doesn't market as well, but it's more similar to that. But anyways, there's two parts to this. I guess there's two things I want to say. Veggie burgers are nothing new. We've been dealing with veggie burgers since the early 80s. There's been a lot of different choice out there for people that have chosen to either cut back on red meat or eliminate red meat, that sort of thing. that is what it is. But the challenge, I think my biggest concern with these kind of products, and especially these ones, is the marketing behind it and how much momentum they're getting around the environment. I'm not sure the health benefits side, it's starting to wane a little bit. It's highly processed, salty. It's not a healthy product. And the people are starting to realize that, but it's the animal welfare side of things and the environment side of things that's pretty scary. The environment is such a hot topic right now. Anybody that can see something, whether they understand or not, and think it's going to help, they're going to do it. And that's where we as producers and as industry do struggle to get that story out there. People talk about water use. Well, they don't really use water. They just cycle water. But, there's a lot of... It always has the negative spin, and we just need to be important in getting that message out there. But again, that could be a presentation in itself. But overall, I was going to say, without the negative connotations, if we look at where beef production's been and where it's going, there's plenty of room, there's plenty of demand for all the protein that we can produce. The challenge is how much does this sort of eat into our beef demand story with that kind of messaging around this product and competing with us. That's what we've got to keep in mind and see. Still pretty early on. So looking at Canada now, we saw the big spike in 2014, 2015, but we talk a lot, always used to talk about volatility, and the market's still relatively volatile. We've actually had some of the flattest markets we've had in decades. We've had 3 years of calf prices basically between $210 to $230 for the most part for average five-weight steer calves. You can see the red line. It's very flat. Even feeder cattle are a little bit more seasonal. The spring is always a tough market. If you're backgrounding feeders, that's in question here. It's hard to fight seasonality. I'm still pretty bullish on cattle markets, but 850 weight steers, there's some of them pushing into the 190 kind of range. The last 3 years, we've seen by March, you get these 850 weight feeders into the 170s, 160s even in cases. Hopefully we don't get into the 60s, but most likely we're going to see softer feeder prices into the spring, because a spring feeder then gets finished in the summer, which is a pretty challenging fed cattle market. So if you got background in feeders, January, the likelihood March, if you're looking at 850 in March, the price is probably going to be lower than it is today. It is good 8 times out of 10. But hopefully it won't decrease as much as the last couple of years. I guess that's how you balance that. And fed cattle prices, they've struggled a little bit last fall, as I said. The plant fire in the United States, we had the issue with Toronto shutting down. But fed cattle prices have jumped back up. Fat steers are where the $1.60, $1.63. Feedlots are making some money. But overall, prices are fairly flat. When you get into these kind of markets, it's always that what's going to break out, to the upside. And that's kind of where the bias lies. There's other things. There's Canadian dollar. There's the economy. That demand picture with trade wars in the U.S. economy. Can it continue to chug along the way it has? Those are all things we got to consider. But right now, the fundamentals look pretty good as we sit today. I talked a bit about cows already. Again, very seasonal. Cows usually drop. But again, the trim cows still dropped last fall, but they didn't drop nearly as much as they had the previous couple of years or on average. Again, we saw trim prices in the U.S. or Canada extremely higher, so they're starting at a higher level. I think our cow slaughter rate in Canada this year, this first quarter, there's less of them around in Alberta on feed. A lot of cows on feed last year. There's less of them. So I think cow prices should see a good seasonal rally into the spring if you got cows that you got to market. So it's not a huge rush. Sometimes we see them flatten here late Jan, early Feb, and then take off from then on into May, June kind of thing. Kind of a messy little chart, but it was trying to show, basically what this shows is what's the Alberta price relative to Manitoba, and it fluctuates quite a bit. But we've seen, and this might understate it a little bit, but right now what we're seeing is Alberta prices are actually pretty much, you got the highest prices almost in Canada here. A little bit of maybe U.S. interest, but a lot of local interest. Some of these Ontario guys buying calves need a background here as they normally do, and then can pick where they want to go with those calves. But again, right now in Manitoba, you've got Western competition, a little bit out of the East, maybe a little bit out of the U.S. So your calf prices have been holding in quite well and actually stronger than a lot of areas. And, there was some 5-weight steers pushing $250, I think, last week. So $250 a pound on a 5-weight steers, that's a pretty good price. But again, you get into a heavier 5, you're probably in the 30s, but still pretty stout prices for calves. Not going. There we go. I talked a little bit about, so on the calf prices have been pretty strong, but I understand, especially in Manitoba, with the feed shortage, feed costs. Last year, we saw margins probably shrink. We saw feed costs go up in 2019. Calf prices were about the same. So you got higher feed costs, similar calf prices. Your profit margins are shrinking. Now, again, this is a broad model. It could be $200 easy on either side of these numbers. It's important to know your numbers, but it's just a general idea what's happening in the cow-calf sector. For the most part, they've been profitable. Not the big profits we saw 14, 15, but I think well-managed operations are still making a few dollars a head. Is it enough, to encourage expansion, or, ultimately, is it enough to get some more grazing land back into production? And that's the challenge we really have for the beef industry in Canada, is our competition for land. But again, small profits there. On the feedlot side of things, as I said, so the blue bar is kind of profits and losses. And for the most part, 2019 wasn't a very profitable year for the feedlots. They didn't have big losses, but the market didn't quite perform last summer, or last spring especially, as expected. So they've been on a bit of a losing streak. But again, we've seen that strength. The red line is fed cattle prices. Feedlots are starting to make money again. And, when they're making money, that's another good driver, a good sign for calf prices and feeder prices. After losing money all year long last fall, they weren't as willing to bet on their cattle and outbid as much on the calves. And that maybe held our market back a little bit. But again, as we head into spring, feedlots are making money. I think they should make money through most of the first quarter. I'm not sure they're going to make money in the summertime. But as I said earlier, our feeder cattle prices through the first quarter probably go down. But again, probably not as much as last year. And a big one will be, if the feedlots continue to make money, that'll help us out a lot. So what's happening in Canada? We talked about, global beef production hasn't changed too much. The U.S. has had a pretty big expansion. Cow-calf producers have been profitable in Canada for the most part. But we've got nothing for herd expansion. Basically, our cow marketings last year are about flat, maybe up a hair. I know probably Manitoba's going to see some cattle down. Cows got sold, cows moved west. But overall in Canada, our cow herd didn't grow in 19. Probably going to shrink a little bit more, unfortunately. So we're not seeing any growth in Canada. Again, I think it's a land use competition, and the dryness, no doubt. A lot of ranching area in Alberta, southwest Saskatchewan was extremely dry last year. Heifers did not get exposed. Cows got culled pretty hard. That's kind of hurt us too. But for the most part, we're not producing any more calves. So if you're in the cow-calf business, you're going to have less calves to compete against this fall, or with this fall. Except, and I'll get to the except in a second. And another reason we're not really expanding, we just haven't kept back the heifers. They look at the breeding heifers were down for the last couple of years. Big part of that's the dryness in Western Canada. But again, we should be keeping 700,000-800,000 breeding heifers across Canada, and we're barely keeping, not much more than 600,000. That's not even quite enough or barely enough to offset all the cows that get slaughtered. So again, we're not going to be expanding in 2019. Really, we're going to have a smaller calf crop in 2020 again. So I said, you're going to have less calves to compete with. Biggest thing that's changed, and if you remember at the start, I showed how much beef production. If you think of those two charts, at the beginning I said we've increased beef production over 20% more beef from 5 years ago, yet I've shown a drastic decline in the number of cattle we have in Canada. So what have we done? Two things we've done. We've kept a lot more cattle in Canada. We used to export between 700,000, 1.2 million head of cattle a year. Now we're closer to that 600,000 or 700,000. But the other thing we've done is we've imported. These are cattle imports. In 2019, we're actually going to be a net importer of feeder cattle. We're actually brought in more. We're still exporting fats and we're exporting cows. We brought in more feeder cattle than we exported. Feedlot sector in Alberta is actually growing. We've seen 2 big years of expanded feedlots. We added a new packing plant in Alberta a couple of years ago. So again, 4 or 5 years ago, the fear was if we keep going down this line, we could lose a packing plant, could lose some more feedlots. We did for a few years. We've actually reversed that. We've actually expanded the feedlots. I don't know if you remember That's already 3 years ago. Western feedlots, 100,000 head feedlot that shut down. 2 of those big lots are back up and running this year finally. Seen two or three brand new builds of feedlots, and these are 15,000, 20,000 head feedlots, and quite a few expansions. So that side of the sector, it's just we've got people wanting the calves, and if the U.S., again, if they start to shrink a little bit, the demand side looks good for calves. We've expanded feeding and packing capacity in Canada. But we did bring in a lot of calves, a lot of dairy calves actually. So just that's how we're driving. But that just goes to show how strong our market has been as well. We're actually out buying U.S. calves. This is just putting our slaughter numbers together, as you can see, over the last 4 years. Kind of same story. You can see from the 2015 low, we've been ratcheting up both by keeping cattle in Canada and through imports. So again, back over 3 million head of cattle processed a year in Canada. So Canadian dollar, I touched on the dollar a little bit earlier. Again, it's been a bit of a partly one of the reasons cattle prices have been so flat is because our Canadian dollar has been so flat. Basically, it's trades between 74 and 77 cents. It's down a bunch today, 76-cent dollar. I wasn't really bullish the dollar. I didn't think we'd get too much strength. But, when we saw that uncertainty in Iran and, unrest in the Middle East isn't usually, or that can be bullish, oil prices and the dollar. And the U.S. dollar, it's kind of been a little bit flaky. It's holding its own, but it'll sell off once in a while. And that's kind of the concern with our dollar. If the U.S. dollar does take a hit or the U.S. economy takes a hit, that could be a bigger driver of our Canadian dollar. But in my mind, we're in a pretty set range, 74 to 77 cents. If we stay in that range, it almost becomes a non-factor for calf prices. But if it starts going above, 78, or if it really bumps above 80, you see when it usually hits 80 or moves above it, it can get pretty extreme. So that would be the worst case scenario. Not predicting that, but just something we got to be aware of for our marketplace. So how do we keep, cattle? How does the market determine where cattle go? Do they go to Ontario? Do they go to Alberta? Or do they go to the U.S.? And really it comes down to what we call basis. Who's got the best prices? And something that's really shifted over the last couple of years. Usually the U.S. is the market driver. They produce 10 times as much beef as us. Take the U.S. price divided by the Canadian dollar and take off 8 or 10 cents a pound, because that's the cost to transport cattle from Western Canada to feedlot areas. And that was our price. The long-term averages were on an 8 to 10 cent discount to the United States. Well, that's changed here in the last 3-4 years. Basically, you can see from 2014, we spent a lot of 2018 at a premium. Western Canada had the strongest prices in North America. Hence, we started bringing cattle, getting cattle imported here. We didn't export, obviously. We had a very, very good marketplace. Got a little sketchy at the beginning of 2019, sorry. That's where our feedlots kind of got hit much money or lost a bunch of money if they didn't risk manage. But we've seen a pretty good recovery come back. We're back to near par. We're actually, again, as we start this year, our Alberta fed cattle prices are the strongest again in North America. So whether we can hold that or not, we'll have to see. As I say, through the first part of this year, I think we've got pretty good bargaining chips. We'll have to see how the fall goes. There's a lot. We got 10% more cattle on feed, 11% more cattle on feed in Western Canada. There's only 2% more in the United States. So when you start seeing that many more cattle on feed, gives a little bit of concern into the summer market. If you play out that scenario, if feedlots have a tough summer and go into fall in rough shape, like being not profitable, that could affect the calf prices. And you can think of feedlots sometimes will gamble easily $100 on your calves. They'll buy, it's like, I think he's worth this, but they go to market, they can't buy them, and they'll spend $100 more and hope the market goes their way. Well, if you think $100 a calf, or call it 120 or whatever, on a 550-pound steer, that's 20 cents a pound. 20 cents a pound. So that's huge. If a feedlot's profitable and willing to gamble $100 or not, there's 20 cents. And this basis for you, this number is, again, maybe just a chart, but that number is huge. If we go from a $10 discount, so typically we sell $10 a hundredweight. discount to the U.S. market. That's like $150 a head, easy math. If we go from a $10 discount to, let's call it par. So feedlots are actually pocketing $150 more per calf than they thought when they bought that calf. Again, on a 500-pound calf, $150 is 30 cents a pound. 30 cents a pound. So this basis in 2017 and 2018, so I'm pointing at the screen, 2017, 2018, that gave our cow-calf producers a lot of money that you did receive for that. So this all comes back to cow-calf. Feedlots are a pretty generous group. If they're making money, they go spend it right away on calves and feeders. So, and sometimes I don't know how many feedlots are here. Sometimes they're a little slow learners. Even if they lose a bunch of money, they'll still gamble for a little while. But they will pull it in, and they did last fall a little bit. So again, they pulled it in last fall. Hopefully they're profitable this year and lets us go in a good track for 2020. Feed grain, that's been a pretty wild ride. The blue line up there, that's barley prices into Lethbridge, Alberta. Extremely high. And this is kind of the mind-boggling thing last year. We were at a huge feed cost disadvantage. Barley was way more expensive. We were importing corn into Lethbridge and importing cattle. Really didn't make sense. They lost a lot of money last year through most of the year, but nonetheless, again, our prices were premium. Our feedlots could sell fat cattle at a premium, and it kind of worked, or it attracted that. When then we saw a huge correction this summer, we saw that spike with the U.S. couldn't plant; they were too wet. We had a huge drought in most of Saskatchewan and Alberta. Rain came, we got more acres, we got more barley, we got a little bit more feed wheat. We saw those prices line right up, but we are back at a feed cost disadvantage again. But again, some of these other market factors are outweighing this feed cost disadvantage. But if barley does continue to run up, it was probably about $190 in the fall, got as low as $190 a ton into Lethbridge. Now it's about $230, $240. It's $1 a bushel more. So that could limit our calf prices a little bit. Just something you got to watch. So price seasonality, I talked a little bit about feeder cattle prices. I know I'm not even sure if I gave the title, or they got this title, The Crystal Ball. I don't really have a crystal ball. Let's let that secret out. I don't have one. So it's a fuzzy one. I got a little bit of an opinion on some of these things, but I don't know for sure. Obviously, nobody does. But there's some pretty simple factors out there you could look at. As I start off on feeder cattle, what's the price of feeder cattle going to be in March compared to January? And this red line seasonally, 850 weight steers from Jan, they go down into March. Hopefully I get proven wrong after I preach this to you that March is going to be lower, and it probably will be. But again, it's very seasonal, and these are 20, 30 years of averages, and there aren't many times that they go up into March. So, what kind of price do we expect? And then when's your strongest prices for 850, 950 weight steers? It's in that August, September, getting pushed all the way into October sometimes. We see good demand for, if you grass cattle, sometimes that peak in that market's coming a little later. And then on the opposite end, calf prices. The fall's weak, we kind of know that. And as I said, we got calf prices now pushing 240, 250. Will it continue to go up? Again, seasonally would suggest there's still more upside on calf prices. I don't know how many guys have 5 and 6 weight steers anymore to sell, but if you do have those lighter type calves, there's a pretty good indication. Assuming we get moisture, we could see a little bit more strength in the calf market. So just to keep that in mind, it's there's some pretty basic principles that actually work pretty good for indicating what do we think the market's going to do. Don't need a crystal ball for this. I talked a little bit about this. Maybe it looks a little bit complicated, but something we saw. This is really how does the price of live cattle compare to wholesale beef prices? And don't really look at the percentages because we're comparing a live animal on a hoof, full, compared to a hanging carcass. So there's a lot of processing, actually into a wholesale box. So again, there's a lot of you take an animal and you're right down to 60% almost instantly that's going to be hanging on the hooks. But we did hit some we're down to about 50%. That ratio went down to about 50% last fall, and that took some money out of our pockets. But we've seen quite a pickup. As I said, we've maybe starting to turn that corner a little bit. We'll have to see. That's a big unknown. I think, as I said, in the summertime, we're going to have a lot of cattle. The packer is going to have probably more more say in the market. But for the next few months, I think, there's not a lot more cattle on feed. We've got that other big U.S. plant expanded and running again. So we've got a little bit more leverage, we call it, for the cattle producers. So hopefully we get a few more dollars of this beef pie this year. So where to from here? I don't know how many guys follow the futures market. And if you don't, you absolutely should be. It is, some people, it's hard to relate. Futures is based in Chicago in U.S. dollars, and there's people on their computers buying and selling stuff. But if you think of that first chart when I showed cattle prices, 2014, 2015 coming down and then flat, futures, it's in a pretty similar format have predicted that. So we talk about a crystal ball. Well, this is my cheat sheet, 100%. The futures they do get a little crazy high, a little crazy low. You got to have an opinion all the time. But, they are the best indicator out there. And we've basically been sideways. And I don't know, if you look at some of these highs from the last couple of years, U.S. and 130 fats, can we break above that? The one thing with the longer time they stay flat, when they do break out, usually the more momentum higher we get. So we'll have to see. As I said, we'll watch what U.S. cattle numbers do and demand. And can we get a break? Will it be this year? Will it be next year? Don't know. But, obviously I'm kind of leaning one way on that side of the markets. And the other thing, I guess, I don't know if I did say at the beginning, our Alberta fed cattle prices or Western Canadian fed prices right now are 163, 164. They're actually higher than they ever got last year. So our fed cattle prices are the highest since 2018, spring of 2018. And there might be some more upside potential there. Why I'm kind of thinking, our calf and feeder market should be well supported heading in through the spring here. Other little rules of thumb I use to break down and stick in this fake crystal ball. Live cattle futures. So they fluctuate. I showed you, the previous chart, right? They're all over. They can jump between 105 and 130 is basically where 105 to 130 is basically where they've been. So they can change a lot. If you're a feedlot going to, flick that forward. Yeah. If you're a feedlot, how does a feedlot decide what they're going to bid on a calf? Especially in the fall. Well, they're going to say, what do I think it's going to be worth when he's going to be finished? Where do they go? They go look at the futures, really. If they go to a packer to get a contract, the packer's going to be looking at the futures market. So every time the futures moves $1, if it goes up $1, a feedlot could roughly pay, if let's say they got a contract based on the futures, they could pay 3 cents more for your price of your calves. It doesn't change that fast, but over time, it's building. Every time it changes $1, that equates to about 3 cents on the price of your calves. If it goes down, futures, you can see it goes in some, and that's why I say follow. What's the trend? Is it trending lower? Or is it trending higher? Or is it sideways? It gives you some idea what to expect for calves. The Canadian dollar is a big one. That's why it's so big. Every time the dollar moves a cent, and again, if it stays within a range, they're not going to move day to day. But a 1 cent change in a dollar is about $4.50 off your calves, 4.5 cents. So that's where it gets a little scary if you run some of these scenarios with a dollar over 80 cents. You add 5 cents to the Canadian dollar, get it to 81 from where it is today. You're going to peel 20 cents off your calf price, holding everything constant. So it's a big one. If it starts to change, if it does start to tank, well, that's okay too. Basis, I talked about basis, how that $5 and $10 shift, just a $1 shift in the basis gives you about 2.5 cents more to your calves. But you saw last year when the basis got really weak, our feeder market weakened off into the spring, and it takes it off the market too. Barley, as I said, that's moved a lot here. And calf prices, as strong as they are, the calf prices today aren't so reliant. If we're talking anything that can go to grass will not be influenced by barley as much, because again, they're banking on the grass market. But again, into the fall, as I said, barley prices have gone up about $1 a bushel. So every time it moves about 50 cents, if grain prices go up 50 cents a bushel, the feedlot can only, on the same sort of break-even analysis, they got to peel about 10 cents off your calves. So a $1 increase is 20 cents off your calves. It becomes pretty extreme. So last fall, part of the reason calf prices held steady, feedlots were not bidding as aggressively. They weren't gambling on the market, but luckily barley tanked right at about the same time. And that kind of gave the feedlots balanced your price. They took the gamble out of the market of $100, but 20 cents a pound, but the barley gave you 20. So we've had a lot of things interact like that lately. Outweight, it's all about weight in the beef industry. We hear, carcass weights are huge. They averaged over 900 pounds last year. Take all the steers across Canada for the entire year, they averaged over 900 pounds. These are big animals we're putting out. We're paid on weight. We sell a lot of hamburger. We sell a lot of, we can slice and dice a carcass differently that deals with these big carcasses. So I don't really see that trend changing. But if you have a steer today, if you've got to buy a steer for $2 a pound or $2.20 a pound, but it only costs you $1 a pound to put it on, the bigger you can grow that steer, the more money you're going to make, or the more you can actually afford to pay. So if you have two steers, one's going to finish at 1,450 pounds, and the other guy's going to convert and grow right to 1,500 pounds. The bigger steers, they're worth 2.5 cents more a pound than the other steer, just because if he can continue to grow based on basically genetics is a big one and how they're fed. Conversion, these are things cow-calf produce we don't really know, or a lot of guys don't know, but this is where opportunity lies. If your cattle do perform good in a feedlot and convert at 5% better than the rest of the feedlot average. So let's say the feedlot bases his steers on 6.5 pounds of feed to get a pound of gain, and yours convert at 6.15, 5% better. They can pay you 4 cents a pound more for those good converting calves. And death loss, health protocols. If you have a 1%, if the feedlot average death loss is 2% for calves, and yours have a 1% average, your calves are worth 3 cents more. So if you look at that, you could have two calves, 550 pounds side by side. But one's going to grow out bigger, one's going to convert better, and one's got a better health program. He's worth 10 cents a pound more, just like that. It's hard to get the data, but if you do feed and work with a feedlot and get some of that back, this is where as an industry we can build on our competitiveness and our efficiency. And a big one I always get is, why are heifers so much cheaper than steers? These numbers pretty much tell you that. It gets a little wide, but if you look at heifers, you can push steers 1,500, 1,600 pounds. Some of those heifers are done at 1,200, 1,300 pounds. Let's say you can feed the same steers 300 pounds bigger. And this is a 50-pound increment. So that's 6 50-pound increments. So just by finishing a steer that much heavier, 6 times 2.5, that's 15 cents. 15 cents just on outweight. That a feedlot can pay more for steers. Then you combine in the conversion. Steers, you're almost looking at a 10% worse conversion on heifers than steers. So throw in another 8 cents on that. There's your 23 cents. Health, other uncertainty. It doesn't take long for a feedlot to get, or as a buyer, to get to 25 cents back on steers and heifers. And that's a big driver of why that does. And I think as feedlots get better with their numbers, that's the reality of it, that they've discounted heifers a little bit more. And, the old 10 cent back, that was with $2 barley. When you're feeding $5 barley, it's a bigger difference. That conversion takes a bigger hit on the heifers compared to $2 barley. How am I doing for time? I'm pretty much... A couple things, I guess, market things to watch. In summary, obviously, assuming demand holds up, and that's a huge assumption, but really banking on good trade and, the U.S. economy and North American economy is not falling apart, pretty optimistic there. That's the demand side holding together. How many dollars will go to the producer? Will we have a glut of cattle at times where, the packers take charge? They may. The China, this U.S. agreement, the U.S. Phase 1 deal, there's some really good provisions for the beef industry in that document, subject to a few testing requirements, but they do recognize the U.S. traceability system in a way that takes away our advantage. We had that. China respected our traceability system. They will now recognize the U.S.'s. But I think anytime if the U.S. can ship more beef out, we all benefit. At the end of the day, that's the big story. But they're also looking at taking the age limits off. They only take under 30-month beef now from North America, so maybe they'll extend that to any ages. And then, as I showed you, they like the hamburger, the grinding meat. So there's some opportunities there for sure, and even taking growth promotants. So then if we have a more open window into China, the biggest importer in the world, could go a long ways. But we got to see how that's going to unfold. The Riding Regency talked about that plant in Toronto closing. Obviously, they're pretty big buyers out here, and we've seen them back off a little bit at times. And are we going to grow the herd? I know Manitoba struggled by far, I think, the most anywhere in Canada for feed supplies and growing. But can we get more cattle to stay around in Canada is yet to be seen. And bred cattle prices, again, when I talk about breeding herd, man, I'm sort of surprised how cheap breeding cows are. They're still only, cull cows are maybe 90 cents, a pound. We're seeing some bred cattle trade for like $1,300. You can sell a steer calf next year for who knows what. Or once price insurance comes out here in the spring, there won't be a lot of gamble if you can get a calf out of that cow and even just get the calf out, sell the calf, sell the cow, worst case scenario. But nonetheless, breeding cow prices have been pretty lackluster, which again doesn't point to much appetite for expansion. I will point out one little thing for anybody if they're looking for more market information. We've got a little bit of support from FCC. We've got a mobile site, basically CanFax. So you can go on there and it's got price, it's got futures markets, it's got the charts, it's got price insurance coverage, and it's also got a little bit of calculators you can play with. They're not the perfect crystal ball again, but what it does, it's connected to the futures, and it'll project. You want to sit here today, and what do we think a 550 weight steer is going to be worth in October? So we can start thinking about marketing this year's calf crop already, and price insurance helps you do that. But it's hooked right into the futures, and as the futures and the Canadian dollar change, you can go see what do you think is going to happen to calf prices. Check it every day or once a week, and is it up or down? It's not going to be the same anyways. And probably the easiest way, if you go to our CanFax website, it's right, just click on that and it brings you right there. It's good on any device. I guess one tiny little plug, if you're looking for market information, so CanFax, we're a division of the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, but we do not get checkoff dollars or government funding or anything like that. If you're looking for market info, we have weekly newsletters. We've got a whole bunch of this charts and data is online. You can go access it any time as a member. Basically for cow-calf, it's $175 for a year to get access to our data and to ourselves. There's myself and 2 other analysts in our office that we're on the phones pretty much all day talking to you, whether it's feedlots, cow-calf producers, on what's going on in the market. If you're marketing feeders or fats or anything like that, just give us a call and we can help you out. And that's part of the membership side of it. And that's my contact info if you'll need it at the office. But that does my spiel. I don't know how we're at for time, but
your presentation was perfectly on time. We're just running a little bit 10 minutes late.
Yeah, okay.
So we don't have time for questions, but are you around?
Yeah, I'm around, yeah.
Fantastic. Can everyone join me in thanking Brian?